Luca Magnotta. In 2010, a video appeared on the internet showing a hooded figure suffocating two kittens with a vacuum-sealed bag. It was stomach-turning, and for most people, scrolling past was the only response that made sense. But a small group of strangers scattered across the world refused to look away. They formed a Facebook group, spent over 18 months analyzing metadata and geolocating background details from the footage, and eventually put a name to the figure in the hood. They warned police, repeatedly, that this person was going to escalate, that he would move from animals to humans. Nobody with a badge took them seriously. 2 years later, they were proven right in the worst possible way. The man they identified was Luca Rocco Magnotta, born Eric Clinton Kirk Newman in Scarborough, Ontario in 1982. He was an aspiring model and low-level adult film performer who had legally changed his name in 2006. He had a documented history of fraud and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia at 18. By the time the online sleuths connected him to the animal cruelty footage, Magnotta had already cultivated a strange digital presence, posting self-edited Wikipedia entries and fabricating connections to well-known figures. The Facebook group, called Find the Kitten Vacuumer for Great Justice, was led by Deanna Thompson and John Green. They did genuine investigative work. They identified a vacuum model sold only in North America. They spotted a U.S. Surgeon General warning on a cigarette pack visible in the footage. They cross-referenced locations using Google Street View to narrow down the filming location. An animal rights activist eventually tipped them off with Magnotta's name directly. Thompson and Green passed everything to law enforcement. Rolling Stone magazine later documented how the sleuths repeatedly warned police he would escalate. And still, nothing happened. On May 24th or 25th, 2012, a 33-year-old Concordia University engineering student named Jun Lin met Magnotta at his apartment on Décarie Boulevard in Montreal. Lin had moved to Canada from Wuhan, China in July 2011 to study engineering and computer science. He was working part-time at a convenience store in Pointe-Saint-Charles while finishing his degree and had just moved into a new apartment in the Griffintown area with a roommate on May 1st, barely 3 weeks earlier. He responded to an online ad, walked into Magnotta's building, and never walked out. Magnotta took Jun Lin's life, filmed the act, and uploaded an 11-minute video to an obscure shock site the same day. Within days, severed remains began arriving in mailed packages across the country. A left foot was sent to the headquarters of the Conservative Party of Canada. A left hand was intercepted en route to the Liberal Party. A torso was discovered in a suitcase behind Magnotta's apartment building. Additional remains were later mailed to 2 elementary schools in Vancouver. Interpol issued a red notice. On June 4th, 2012, Magnotta was arrested inside a Berlin internet cafe. He was sitting calmly at a computer, reading news articles about himself. The trial lasted weeks. The defense argued diminished responsibility due to Magnotta's schizophrenia diagnosis, claiming he was not criminally responsible. The jury rejected that argument. On December 23, 2014, after 8 days of deliberation, they convicted Magnotta of first-degree murder, criminal harassment, indignities to a body, and mailing obscene material. He received a mandatory life sentence with no eligibility for parole for 25 years, plus 19 concurrent years on additional charges. He withdrew his appeal in February 2015. Magnotta married a fellow inmate named Anthony Jolin in June 2017. In August 2022, he was transferred from maximum security Port Cartier to medium security La Macasa institution in Quebec. Reports from March 2024 indicated that Magnotta now identifies as transgender and goes by the name Violette. He is eligible for day parole on June 4, 2034, and full parole on June 4, 2037. The online group that identified him years before the taking of Junlin's life had done everything right. They found him, they flagged him, and they told the authorities exactly what was coming. And the system simply was not built to listen. And sometimes, the people investigating from behind a screen are not strangers hunting a suspect. Sometimes, the person they are looking for is the one hiding behind a screen too, building trust, draining bank accounts, and waiting for the right moment to act. D.D. Moore. In November 2006, a laborer named Abraham Shakespeare bought a Florida lottery ticket and won $30 million. He took the lump sum, roughly $17 million after taxes, and almost immediately began giving it away. To family, to friends, to people he barely knew. Shakespeare was generous in a way that made the people around him feel comfortable asking for more, and then more, and then more again. He did not have financial advisors or attorneys managing his money. He had a big heart and an open wallet, and in Lakeland, Florida, that combination made him a target. In October 2008, a woman named Doris Donegan Moore approached Shakespeare with a pitch. She told him she wanted to write a book about his life, about what it was like to win the lottery and stay grounded. Moore was persuasive, polished, and persistent. She owned a healthcare staffing agency called American Medical Professionals. What Shakespeare did not know was that Moore had been convicted of insurance fraud and falsely reporting a crime back in 2001, and that she had filed for bankruptcy in 2002. Within months, she had inserted herself into his finances through a sham company called Abraham Shakespeare LLC, withdrawing about $1 million to buy a Hummer, a Corvette, and a truck. In April 2009, Abraham Shakespeare was shot twice in the chest and buried under a concrete slab in the backyard of a Plant City home that Moore had purchased. He was 42 years old. For months afterward, nobody reported him missing. Moore worked to keep up the illusion that Shakespeare was still alive. She impersonated him through text messages sent from his phone. She arranged for an associate named Greg Smith to call Shakespeare's mother, pretending to be Abraham. In December 2009, she gave a newspaper interview casually claiming that Shakespeare had simply run away from the pressures of his wealth. She even posted on Facebook, asking where he might have gone, performing confusion she had no reason to feel. And somehow, it gets worse. When Shakespeare was finally reported missing in November 2009, an online forum began digging through public records. Forum members uncovered Moore's prior fraud conviction and her bankruptcy and shared their findings with investigators. They mapped the timeline of her involvement with Shakespeare, noted inconsistencies in her public statements, and flagged the sheer volume of financial transactions she had made using his money. The digital trail Moore herself left behind while impersonating Shakespeare only deepened suspicion. Her media appearances, her social media posts, and her increasingly transparent lies started collapsing under the weight of public scrutiny from people who had never met either of them, but recognized that the story she was telling simply did not add up. The investigative breakthrough came from Greg Smith himself. The same man Moore had recruited to impersonate Shakespeare on the phone agreed to work as a police informant. He wore an audio recording device concealed inside a Red Bull can and captured Moore making incriminating admissions on tape. Shakespeare's body was discovered in January 2010. Moore was arrested on February 2, 2010, and formally charged with first-degree murder on February 19th. At trial in December 2012, The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. Moore was convicted of first-degree murder and possessing and discharging a firearm resulting in death. She received life in prison without parole, plus a mandatory 25-year minimum. Moore, now 53, remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution Annex in Ocala, Florida. Her appeals were rejected in 2015 and 2019. A 2023 evidentiary motion alleging police corruption was dismissed, with the judge calling her claims confusing, conclusory, and vague. She continues to maintain her innocence, most recently in a 2025 ABC interview titled "Unlucky Numbers." Abraham Shakespeare spent the final years of his life surrounded by people who wanted his money. D.D. Moore was simply the one willing to go the furthest to take it. And she might have gotten away with all of it if the people watching from behind their keyboards had not started asking questions she could not answer. Not every piece of evidence that breaks a case comes from forensics or informants, though. Sometimes it is a single photograph, posted carelessly, that ties a suspect to the crime before they even realize what they have done. Cheyenne Antoine. On the night of March 24th, 2015, two 18-year-old friends in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, posed for a selfie and uploaded it to Facebook. Cheyenne Antoine and Brittany Gargle had been close since 9th grade, and the photo looked like any other picture two young women might take before a night out. There was nothing remarkable about it, except for one detail that would later become the centerpiece of a murder investigation. Antoine was wearing a wide black braided belt. Hours after that photo was posted, that same belt would be found beside Brittany Gargle's body. Gargle was found strangled on a road near the Saskatoon City landfill on the morning of March 25th, 2015. She was 18 years old, 4 months out of high school, with her whole life in front of her. She and Antoine had been drinking that evening. At some point, an argument broke out between them, and it escalated quickly. Antoine struck Gargle, then used the belt to take her life, leaving her body on the road. Antoine's background was difficult by any measure. She had lost both parents young and had been raised in the foster care system. She had a prior record that included shoplifting and a threat against a store employee. None of that excuses what happened that night, but it paints a picture of someone who had been falling through the cracks of every institution meant to catch her for a long time. In the hours after taking Gargle's life, Antoine went on Facebook and posted messages asking where Gargle was, as if she had no idea what had happened. She played confused. She played worried. She also tried to establish an alibi by suggesting the two of them had visited a local bar called Colonial Pub and Grill that evening, a claim that was later disproven through additional social media posts and digital records. Saskatoon police made the critical connection when they realized the murder weapon, the belt found at the crime scene, matched the one clearly visible in the selfie posted just hours before. Senior Crown Prosecutor Robin Ritter later described the moment they linked the two as the breakthrough that changed the entire direction of the investigation. DNA testing confirmed Antoine's presence on the belt. Dust marks on Gargle's car were also consistent with a struggle involving the belt. And investigators used Antoine's own Facebook timeline to reconstruct the full sequence of the evening and dismantle her false alibi piece by piece. Every post, every timestamp, every tagged location became a thread that pulled the story apart. The investigation revealed that the crime was not premeditated in any traditional sense. There was no planning, no weapon brought to the scene, no calculated setup. It was an argument that spiraled out of control between two intoxicated teenagers, one of whom removed the belt she was wearing and used it to take the life of someone she had called a friend for years. Because none of it was planned, Antoine had no time to think about what she was leaving behind online. To put it plainly, Antoine posed for a photograph, wearing the very thing she would use to take her friend's life, posted it for the world to see, and then went online afterward pretending to look for the person she had left on the side of a road. Antoine was arrested in March 2017, initially charged with second-degree murder. On January 15, 2018, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter in a joint Crown Defense submission and told the court she did not remember taking Gargol's life. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Having received that sentence in 2018, Antoine has now completed her term. As of April 2026, there are no public records indicating any active legal proceedings. The case has been referenced in courtrooms and law school lectures ever since as one of the clearest examples of social media evidence driving a conviction. It was featured on Oxygen's Final Moments in 2023. Gargol's family has never spoken publicly about whether the 7-year sentence felt adequate for the loss of their daughter. Antoine's case proved that a careless post could unravel a crime overnight. But what happens when a case goes cold for over 2 decades, and it takes an entirely different kind of online effort to drag it back into the light? Danny Heinrich. Some cases are solved in days. Others take decades. And in the rarest, worst cases, the answer only comes because a community refuses to let the world forget, long after the system has moved on. On October 22, 1989, a young boy named Jacob Wetterling was riding his bike home from a convenience store in St. Joseph, Minnesota, with his brother Trevor and a friend named Aaron Larson. They had just rented a video. A masked man stepped out of the darkness, ordered the boys off their bikes at gunpoint, and sent Trevor and Aaron away. Jacob was taken. He was never seen alive again. The disappearance of Jacob Wetterling became one of the most prominent missing child cases in American history. It consumed the small community of St. Joseph and rippled outward for years. His parents, Patty and Jerry Wetterling, channeled their grief into advocacy, and the case directly led to the 1994 Jacob Wetterling Act, one of the earliest federal offender registration laws in the United States. The case reshaped how the country thought about child safety, and for 27 years, it remained unsolved. Danny James Heinrich, who was 26 at the time, lived in Annandale, Minnesota. He had been a person of interest early in the investigation. 9 months before Jacob's disappearance, in January 1989, Heinrich had abducted and harmed a young boy in nearby Cold Spring. But the forensic technology of the era could not connect him definitively to either crime, and the investigation stalled. Leads dried up. The case went cold. What brought it back was a combination of advanced DNA testing and relentless public pressure. In 2015, improved forensic methods matched Heinrich's DNA to evidence recovered from what had been done to the boy in Cold Spring. But the renewed attention would not have happened without amateur online investigators, and most notably, the investigative podcast In the Dark by APM Reports. The podcast launched a meticulous, deeply reported examination of the case, scrutinizing the law enforcement failures that had allowed it to go cold for so long. It questioned why Heinrich had not been more aggressively pursued, why leads had been dropped, and why a community had been left without answers for nearly 3 decades. The series drew national media coverage and kept sustained public pressure on authorities at the critical moment when the DNA evidence was being processed. Online forums and social media amplified the podcast's findings, and the story of Jacob Wetterling began trending again for the first time in years. Heinrich was named publicly as a person of interest in October 2015. When investigators searched his home, they found illegal material involving minors. He was arrested on October 28, 2015. Under a plea agreement, Heinrich confessed in open court on September 6, 2016. He described taking Jacob to a gravel pit near Painesville, where he harmed the boy, and then, in a panic at the sound of a passing police car, took his life. He then led investigators to the burial site, where Jacob's remains were recovered for the first time in 27 years. The statute of limitations had long since expired on the original charges. Prosecutors lacked independently obtained evidence of the taking of Jacob's life, so the plea was structured around a single federal count of receiving illegal material. It was an agonizing compromise. The man who had confessed in open court to taking a child's life could not be charged with that crime. On November 21, 2016, Judge John Thunheim sentenced Heinrich to the statutory maximum of 20 years, acknowledging in court that the sentence was inadequate given the gravity of what Heinrich had done. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not for 27 years. It took a podcast, a community that refused to let go, and a DNA match that nearly came too late to finally bring Jacob Wetterling home. Heinrich, now 62, is incarcerated at Federal Medical Center Devens in Massachusetts. With a scheduled release date of March 28, 2033, Minnesota authorities retain the option to pursue civil commitment as a dangerous person when his federal sentence ends. Heinrich's case showed what happens when a community keeps pushing long after the system gives up. But in 2012, a case in a small Ohio town would prove that sometimes the evidence is not buried at all. Sometimes the people involved post it themselves in real time for the entire world to see. Trent Mays and Malik Richmond. On the night of August 11, 2012, a high school student from Weirton, West Virginia, attended a series of house parties in Steubenville, Ohio. Steubenville was a small city where high school football was treated with something close to reverence, and the players involved in what happened that night were part of that culture. The girl became incapacitated by alcohol over the course of the evening. While she was unconscious, she was carried between locations by her wrists and ankles. Two Steubenville high school football players, 16-year-old quarterback Trent Mays and 16-year-old wide receiver Malik Richmond, harmed her. She had no ability to consent, and she had no memory of what had been done to her. What made this case unlike almost any before, it was that the evidence did not come from a crime scene examination or a witness interview. It came from the assailants and bystanders themselves. The victim was photographed while unresponsive, and the images were posted to social media. A former student recorded a 12-minute video in which he joked repeatedly and graphically about what had occurred. The footage spread across the internet before investigators had even begun their formal work. Crime blogger Alexandria Goddard, who had grown up in Steubenville, was among the first to recognize what was unfolding. She began archiving screenshots of tweets, Facebook posts, and Instagram images that the participants had already started deleting. Her blog, Prinnified, became the first sustained public record of the digital trail that the people involved were actively trying to erase. Without her work, much of that evidence would have been gone before police ever saw it. Goddard faced legal pushback for her efforts, including a defamation lawsuit that was later settled. But her archives proved critical in establishing the timeline of events. Then, on January 1st, 2013, the hacktivist collective Anonymous intervened. An offshoot called NightSec breached a local football booster website and released a video showing teenage boys laughing about what had been done to the victim. The footage went viral and triggered national outrage, transforming what had been a local story into a nationwide reckoning over how institutions protect athletes at the expense of victims. Investigators ultimately seized 15 phones and 2 tablets and recovered hundreds of text messages from dozens of students, constructing a forensic timeline that the defendants could not dispute. On March 17, 2013, Judge Thomas Lipps found both Mays and Richmond guilty. Mays was additionally convicted of distributing an image of the victim. Mays received 2 years in juvenile detention. Richmond received 1 year. Both were placed on the state's offender registry. The sentences drew immediate criticism from advocacy groups and commentators who argued they were disproportionately lenient given the severity of the crime. 3 adults were later indicted for obstructing the investigation, and the Steubenville school superintendent, Michael McVeigh, was indicted on felony charges of tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice in November 2013. The case exposed a culture of protection around the football program, one where coaches, administrators, and school officials seemed far more worried about protecting the team's reputation than about what had been done to a 16-year-old girl. Richmond was released on January 5, 2014. Mays was released in January 2015. Richmond went on to play football at Youngstown State University, and in February 2018, he was removed from Ohio's juvenile offender registry by the same judge who had originally convicted him. Mays played football at Central State University and does not appear on the public registry because the conviction occurred when he was a juvenile. And no, I'm not making that up. Both individuals convicted in this case returned to competitive athletics and had their registry status reduced or eliminated within a few years. As of 2026, neither Mays nor Richmond faces active legal proceedings related to the case. Richmond's father, Nathaniel Richmond, was shot in an unrelated courthouse incident in August 2017 and did not survive. After Steubenville, nobody could pretend that social media was just noise. The crime had been documented in real time by the very people involved. It was not investigators who built the case first. It was a blogger archiving deletions, a hacktivist collective leaking footage, and a generation of teenagers who treated social media like it was disposable, only to watch it become a permanent record of exactly what they had done. The digital footprint they left behind was not a clue. It was a confession, scattered across a dozen platforms, waiting for someone to piece it together. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Julio Heredia. On February 24, 2006, a 24-year-old mother of 2 named Crystal Theobald was sitting in the passenger seat of a car in the Arlanza neighborhood of Riverside, California, with her boyfriend Juan Patlan and her brother Justin. They were driving through a residential area after visiting family. They were not involved in anything criminal. They were simply in the wrong place at a moment when a group of gang members mistook their vehicle for one belonging to a rival crew. Someone in a white Ford Expedition opened fire. Crystal was struck in the head. She was rushed to Riverside Community Hospital, where she held on for 2 days before passing. Patlan was shot in the abdomen, but survived. Crystal left behind 2 young children who would grow up without their mother. The shooter was Julio Cesar Heredia, known on the street as Lil Huero. He was 18 at the time and had been a member of the Barrio 5150 gang since he was 14. Police identified the white expedition early on and had a general description of the people inside it. But the case stalled almost immediately. Witnesses in the neighborhood were afraid to cooperate. Dozens of people had seen or heard something that night, and not one of them was willing to come forward. The wall of silence was total. What happened next was not a police breakthrough. It was a mother who decided to do the work herself. Crystal's mother, Belinda Lane, and her 16-year-old niece, Jamie McIntyre, began creating fake MySpace profiles to infiltrate the gang's social circle. The first account they made was a fake young woman named Rebecca. When that one drew too much attention, they switched to a new profile called Angel, built using Crystal's own photographs. It was a risky decision, emotionally and practically, but Lane was willing to use any tool she had. McIntyre, posing as Angel, befriended members of the 5150 and engaged them in casual conversation over weeks and months, slowly building trust without raising suspicion. Eventually, a member named William Sotelo, known as Jokes, admitted in a message that he owned the white Ford Expedition. The vehicle matched the one identified at the scene of the shooting. Lane created dozens of additional fake accounts to map the gang's full structure, identifying members, associates, and connections that police had been unable to establish through traditional methods. She passed everything she gathered to Riverside detective Rick Wheeler. When Lane eventually sent Sotelo a message through one of her profiles asking him directly why he took Crystal's life, Sotelo panicked and fled to Mexico. It would be another decade before he was found. Information gathered from interrogated gang members ultimately identified Heredia as the one who pulled the trigger. He was arrested and on May 20th, 2011, was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and additional charges. Lane's family had specifically asked prosecutors to take the death penalty off the table. He was sentenced to life without parole, plus 138 years to life. Sotelo was located in central Mexico in May 2016, after a Facebook tip was sent directly to Lane, who forwarded it to authorities. Even a decade later, she was still watching, still checking her messages, still running accounts. Sotelo was extradited back to the United States, and in January 2020 pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter with gang and firearm enhancements. He received 22 years. In total, 10 members of the 5150 were convicted in connection with the case, with sentences ranging from probation to 18 years. Heredia, now 38, is incarcerated at California State Prison in Sacramento. He will never be eligible for release. The case was the subject of Netflix's 2021 documentary, Why Did You Kill Me?, which depicted Lane and McIntyre's investigation in detail. A mother and a teenager, armed with fake profiles and a family photo, did what a police department with full resources could not. They infiltrated a gang, identified a suspect, and built a map of a criminal network from a laptop in their living room. But not every case requires infiltration. Sometimes the connection between two unsolved crimes sits in a database for decades, waiting for the right pair of detectives to realize they are looking at the same man. Dennis Bowman. In September 1980, a 25-year-old woman named Kathleen Doyle was found in her home on Granby Street in Norfolk, Virginia. She had been assaulted and strangled. Her husband, Navy pilot Lieutenant Stephen Doyle, was deployed overseas aboard the USS Eisenhower at the time. There were no witnesses, no immediate suspects, and no arrest. The case went cold for nearly 4 decades. Over 1,000 miles away and 9 years later, in Hamilton, Michigan, a young girl named Andrea Bowman disappeared. Born Alexis Miranda Badger in New Orleans, she had been adopted as an infant by Dennis and Brenda Bowman. In the weeks before she vanished, she had told school officials and a family court that her adoptive father had been abusing her. On March 11, 1989, Dennis Bowman reported her as a runaway. Police accepted that explanation without significant investigation. Andrea was never seen again. She had been in their care since she was a baby, and when she finally found the courage to speak up about what was happening to her, the system let her down completely. Nobody connected these two cases for 30 years. The man responsible for both was the same person, Dennis Lee Bowman was a Navy veteran with a 1981 conviction for a violent offense and a 1999 felony breaking and entering charge. His history was documented, but it existed in fragments across different jurisdictions that never spoke to each other. The Doyle case broke open through forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had only recently entered mainstream law enforcement use. Norfolk detective Jonathan Smith uploaded DNA recovered from Doyle's bedsheet to public genealogy databases, the same method that had been used to crack the Golden State case in 2018. He built a family tree from the genetic matches and narrowed his suspect list to 31 relatives. Bowman was among them, though initially ranked at the bottom of the list. The Bowman case broke open through Facebook. Andrea's biological mother, Kathy Turkanian, had given her daughter up for adoption as a newborn and only learned in 2010 that Andrea had been missing for over 2 decades. Turkanian launched a Facebook page called Find Andrea M. Bowman and began connecting with people who had known her daughter in high school. Former classmates came forward and reported that Andrea had disclosed abuse by her adoptive father. Those reports reached investigators. The 2 investigations converged at a cold case homicide conference in Virginia in 2019. When Detective Smith met Michigan State Police Detective Brian Fuller. Fuller recognized Bowman's name immediately as the longtime suspect in Andrea's disappearance. The DNA profile from the Doyle case matched. 2 detectives from 2 different states, working 2 seemingly unrelated cases, had been circling the same man for years without knowing it. Bowman was arrested on November 22, 2019, in Allegan County, Michigan. After his arrest, recorded jail phone calls captured Bowman telling his wife Brenda that he had struck Andrea, that she had fallen down a stairwell and died, and that he had disposed of her remains. He described dismembering her body and placing the remains in a barrel, which he later moved when the family relocated in 1990. Andrea's remains were recovered on February 4, 2020, beneath a concrete slab in the backyard of his Monterey Township home. That's not a typo, by the way. For 31 years, Andrea Bowman's remains were buried in the yard of the man who had adopted her and then taken her life. In June 2020, Bowman pleaded guilty in Norfolk to first-degree murder, assault, and burglary in the Doyle case. He received 2 life sentences, plus 20 years. On December 22, 2021, he pleaded no contest to second-degree murder for Andrea's death and was sentenced to 35 to 50 years, exceeding the guidelines. Bowman, now 78, is serving his Virginia life sentences. Kathy Turkanian's search for her daughter is documented in Netflix's 2024 docuseries Into the Fire. The Lost Daughter. 2 cold cases, 2 different states, 2 different decades. One was solved by a detective uploading DNA to a genealogy database. The other was solved by a mother who built a Facebook page and refused to stop asking questions. Neither would have been enough alone. Together, they brought him down. But what about the cases where the person responsible is not lurking in the shadows at all, but sitting in a chat room, pretending to be someone who understands? William Melchert Dinkle. In 2005, a 32-year-old IT technician named Mark Drybrough, living in Coventry, England, took his own life by hanging. He had been struggling, and he had gone online looking for people who understood what he was going through. 3 years later, in March 2008, an 18-year-old Carleton University freshman named Nadia Kajuji from Brampton, Ontario, jumped from a bridge into the Rideau River in Ottawa. She was in her first year of university and had been reaching out in chat rooms during a period of deep distress. Her body was recovered the following month. 2 deaths in 2 different countries that appeared unconnected. What linked them was a man in Faribault, Minnesota, who had been hiding behind fake identities in online suicide forums posing as young female nurses and systematically encouraging vulnerable people to end their lives. His name was William Melchert Dinkel, and he later admitted to entering at least 10 fake suicide pacts over a period of 4 to 5 years, describing the experience as the thrill of the chase. Melchert Dinkel was a licensed nurse. He used aliases like Lee Dow, Cammy D, and Falcon Girl to gain the trust of people who were already in crisis. He provided Drybro with specific technical instructions on how to carry out the act. He urged Kajuji to do the same over webcam, though she ultimately died by a different method. He told investigators he had encouraged dozens of people, though the full number may never be known. The person who stopped him was not a police officer or a federal agent. It was a retired British schoolteacher named Celia Blay. In November 2006, Blay learned that a friend in South America had entered an online suicide pact with someone claiming to be a young nurse. The story troubled her enough that she decided to investigate. Beginning in January 2008, Blay and an associate named Kat Lowe set up their own sting operation inside suicide chat rooms. They posed as vulnerable users, engaged with a person using the name Cammy D, and slowly drew out identifying details over the course of weeks. Melchert Dinkel eventually revealed that he had watched a man from Birmingham die by hanging over webcam, a detail that matched the circumstances of Drybro's death precisely. Blay and Lowe captured Melchert Dinkel on his own webcam and traced his IP address to Faribault, Minnesota. Blay contacted the FBI. They did not respond. She persisted, reaching out to the St. Paul Police Department and the Minnesota Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, who recognized the seriousness of what she had uncovered and took the case on. On March 15, 2011, Melchert Dinkel was convicted on 2 counts of assisting suicide and sentenced to 360 days in jail with a suspended 3-year prison term. But the legal fight was far from over. On appeal, the Minnesota Supreme Court reversed in March 2014, ruling that the statutory language around advising and encouraging was unconstitutionally broad under the First Amendment, though the court upheld the narrower legal prong of actively assisting. The ruling forced courts to answer a question they had mostly avoided until then, which was where exactly the line falls between saying something awful online and actually helping someone die. On remand, he was reconvicted of 1 count of assisting Drybro's death and 1 count of attempting to assist Kajuji's. He was resentenced to 178 days in jail and 10 years of probation. Melchert Dinkel was released from Rice County Jail on February 18, 2015. His 10-year probation period concluded in early 2025. As of April 2026, he has not reoffended publicly. His nursing license was revoked in June 2009. A retired teacher in England, working from her home computer, identified and exposed a dangerous individual that the FBI initially declined to pursue. She did not have a badge or warrant or any formal training in criminal investigation. She had patience, an internet connection, and the instinct to follow a story that felt wrong until she found the person behind it. What Blay did from her living room changed how investigators in multiple countries thought about online harm, and it proved that you do not need a title or department behind you to save lives. Not every online investigation is quiet and methodical, though. Sometimes, the person breaking open a cold case is not hiding behind an alias. Sometimes, they are standing in front of a camera, broadcasting their grief to anyone willing to watch. Charles Guerin. On July 24, 2011, a young woman named Nikisha Hodges Hawkins was attending a birthday party at Kruger Memorial Park in Michigan City, Indiana. She had graduated from Michigan City High School just weeks earlier. She wanted to become a pediatrician. She was 4 days away from her 18th birthday. As she was leaving the park that night, her life was taken. Police arrived quickly. They interviewed dozens of witnesses and partygoers. One of the people they spoke to that same day was a 16-year-old named Charles Guerin III, who had attended the party. He had changed his clothes before the interview. His mother was present and both denied any involvement. Despite speaking to dozens of potential witnesses, not a single person cooperated with the investigation. The case went cold. For 5 years, Nikisha's father, Calvin Hawkins, did everything he could think of to get someone to talk. He reached out to police repeatedly and was met with the same answer every time. No witnesses, no cooperation, no progress. He scoured social media on his own for any mention of the crime, and he found plenty. Rumors circulated online pointing to Guerin, and commenters on various platforms had been discussing his possible involvement for years. People were willing to type what they would never say to a detective. None of those posts translated into formal tips or willing witnesses. But Hawkins saved everything. So Hawkins did something that nobody expected. In 2016 and 2017, he launched a series of Facebook Live broadcasts from his home, his car, and the streets of Michigan City, pleading for tips, naming names, and showing the online comments people had made about the case over the years. One video ran 20 minutes and went viral, shared thousands of times across the state of Indiana. He was raw, emotional, and relentless. He turned his grief into public pressure, and he did it on camera, in real time, with his daughter's name on his lips. The broadcasts generated a wave of attention that the case had not received in 5 years, and they made it clear to the community that silence was no longer an option. And then the tip came. Renewed police interest, driven in part by the public scrutiny Hawkins had created, led to Guerin's arrest in December 2016. When the state prepared a plea deal that would have resulted in roughly 8 years, with only 1 year actually served in jail, Hawkins went back to social media. He used Facebook to organize a campaign that flooded the prosecutor's office with calls demanding a tougher sentence. The public response was overwhelming. The judge unexpectedly rejected the plea deal in July 2017 and sent the case to trial. At trial in September 2017, prosecutors proved that Guerin had a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his leg, one he had previously claimed was from a drive-by shooting. The wound demonstrated that he had access to firearms at the time of the crime, and the inconsistency in his story undermined his credibility with the jury. After 7 days of testimony, a LaPorte County jury convicted Guerin of murder. On October 31st, 2017, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison with credit for 314 days served. The Indiana Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction in September 2018, and the Indiana Supreme Court declined further review. Guerin, now 31, is incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, with an expected release date of approximately 2040. The case was profiled in Hulu's Web of Death in 2023. Nikisha's parents release balloons every year on July 28th, her birthday. Calvin Hawkins used Facebook Live to do what 5 years of traditional investigation could not. He put a face on the grief, named the people the community had been whispering about, and made it impossible for anyone to look away. It was not subtle, it was not quiet, and it made some people uncomfortable. But it worked. A father with a phone and a Facebook account accomplished what a full police department had failed to do for half a decade. But in Spain, a very different kind of online trail was forming. A convicted individual, released after nearly 3 decades behind bars, was posting hiking videos on TikTok, building a small following, and quietly preparing to take lives again. José Jurado Montilla. In the 1980s, a man from Badajoz, Spain, took the lives of 4 people across the Malaga region. A neighbor named Francisco González was found dead in a farmhouse in November 1985. A chauffeur named Antonio Paniagua Peral was set on fire in Campanillas in March 1987. 2 tourists, Peter Glenn from the United Kingdom and Klaus Schmucker from Germany, were shot near the Caminito del Rey Trail in May 1987. The man responsible for all 4 was José Jurado Montilla. He was convicted and sentenced to 123 years. He served 28 of them. In December 2013, Montilla was released after the European Court of Human Rights struck down Spain's so-called Paro Doctrine, a legal interpretation that had allowed courts to extend the effective prison terms of convicted individuals well beyond the standard maximum. The ruling was intended to protect prisoners' rights, but its practical effect was the release of Montilla and dozens of other convicted offenders back into the general population. Montilla walked out of prison at the age of 52 and disappeared into the Spanish countryside. What nobody anticipated was that he would show up on TikTok under the usernames Dinamita Montilla and El Titi. He built a small following of roughly 3,000 people, posting hiking and travel content as he moved through Spain with no fixed address. He was living out of hostels and shelters, documenting his travels on a platform where nobody knew or checked who he was. In late August 2023, a 42-year-old woman from Seville named Esther Estepa vanished after meeting Montilla at a hostel in Alicante. She was an avid hiker, a single woman traveling alone, and she had crossed paths with a man whose past she did not know. On September 8th, Montilla called Estepa's mother, Josefa, professing concern about her daughter's whereabouts. He even posted TikTok videos expressing worry. Josefa did what anyone in her position might do. She typed his name into a search engine. What came back was a serial offender's criminal record spanning 4 decades. The family alerted police immediately, but Montilla was nomadic, moving constantly, with no registered address to trace. Traditional methods of locating a suspect were useless against someone living out of a backpack. Spanish National Police turned to the one thing he had been doing consistently. They scraped and geolocated his TikTok videos, frame by frame, analyzing background landmarks, terrain features, building facades, and timestamps to map his movements across the country. Each video he posted became a breadcrumb. Each scenic background became a data point. The very platform he had used to build a harmless public persona became the tool investigators used to track him. Meanwhile, DNA work on a separate case connected Montilla to the death of a 21-year-old college student identified publicly only as David, who had been shot on his family's farm in Los Montes de Malaga in August 2022. Investigators obtained a familial DNA match from a backpack zipper at that scene, and undercover officers later collected a direct DNA sample from Montilla to confirm it. On May 20th, 2024, police arrested Montilla at a sports bar near the Spain-Portugal border in Badajoz, just as he appeared to be preparing to flee the country. When they searched his phone, they found photographs and video of a body in a sleeping bag matching Estepa, along with evidence that his mobile hotspot had been used to send deceptive farewell texts to Estepa's mother on August 23, 2023. Estepa's skull was discovered in February 2024 near Bairen Castle in Gandia, with roughly 60 bone fragments recovered. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, and forensic findings from late 2025 indicated she had been subjected to further harm while still alive. Montilla, now 64, has been formally charged with the deaths of both David and Estepa and remains in pretrial detention. He denies both. Trial dates had not been set as of the March 2026 premiere of Netflix's two-part docuseries on the case, directed by Hector Muñente. Under Spanish law, the maximum sentence for each count is 30 years. As of April 2026, Montilla remains in custody awaiting trial. The case has reignited international debate over the European Court of Human Rights ruling that freed him, and over the regulatory responsibility of platforms like TikTok for amplifying content from convicted offenders without any verification of who is behind the account. 10 cases, 10 different corners of the internet, and the same lesson every time. The things people post, delete, and think nobody will ever see have a way of outliving them. Sometimes that trail catches the person responsible. Sometimes it convicts a friend. And sometimes it is the only thing standing between a grieving family and a case that never gets solved. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.